Well, all right. Welcome, fellow hacks, to the latest Classroom Hacks review. And on this particular episode, we are talking about Matthew McConaughey's Greenlights. This was a fun listen that I had the pleasure of listening to, as Mr. McConaughey was the orator and reader of his own memoir. So it's definitely nice to get his personality in the mix of all of that. And it was just a nice sort of insight into many of the adventures and experiences he's had over the last 50 years of his life, and kind of detailing some of his triumphs and fails as a child, and then in acting, and then as a parent and a partner. And as always, before we get into this review, I just want to remind you that we are live from the Pantheon of Pedagogy, the Mecca of Methodology, your vacation from vacation with your educational excavators. This is, and we are, Classroom Hacks. Classroom Hacks is here today, and we are talking about Greenlights, Matthew McConaughey's memoir. As with many of my other reviews, again, I did listen to this one on Audible, primarily because I heard that Mr. McConaughey was reading it. So obviously, when I can get that nice Southern gentleman drawl in a review, why wouldn't I pick that up and listen to it? Later on down the road, I will be listening to Bryan Cranston's book, and I am assuming he reads it as well, and I can't wait to hear Walter White come through my headphones as I listen in. But as always, before we start these reviews, I wanted to give just some brief background on Greenlights. This summary comes from shortform.com. And for the summary, Shortform writes, Matthew McConaughey's Greenlights is not a conventional memoir. As he neared age 50, the Oscar-winning actor revisited the journal that he had kept for the previous 35 years to see what he could learn from it. The results in this book, which combine hard-earned insights about the art of living with vivid accounts of McConaughey's upbringing in rural Texas, his adventures in the movie business, his global travels, and his lifelong search for love and fatherhood. Part autobiography and part life guide, Greenlights both explains and illustrates McConaughey's philosophy of catching green lights, recognizing and even creating those moments when life says yes and you cruise into success as you pursue your destiny. It's valuable reading for anyone in search of an entertaining manual or finding your way in the world. Now, as short form sort of alludes to, this memoir is primarily meant to be entertaining, though there are plenty of bits of wisdom and advice and guidance that McConaughey does provide that I thought were extremely insightful and illuminating. But obviously, due to the different sort of life circumstances that he's had and that many viewers and listeners probably had, including myself, we aren't as familiar with the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, maybe just from the outside looking in, but obviously from someone who has lived it as himself, he can sort of elaborate on different experiences that many of us may only dream of. Unlike other books like Brene Brown's Atlas of the Heart or James Clear's Atomic Habits, this doesn't necessarily give you the sort of sit-down template for examining your habits or your emotions, but it is an extremely entertaining guide that does go to the heart of himself, and in many cases does touch the audience in ways that we can relate to, especially myself, in terms of being a partner and fatherhood, and then also just the pursuit of your own dreams, getting to certain opportunities that you have and taking advantage of those times, those green lights, as he says, that you may not get the opportunity for again. Or you will, but you just may have to pivot and go in a different direction to catch more of those green lights. So to sort of elaborate past the short form summary, my take on this particular book was that at the start of it, Greenlights does start off a bit cluttered and fast-paced. So when I first started listening to it, I thought, oh man, this book got really high reviews, but McConaughey is sort of dipping into the true detective character as he's kind of going really fast and thinking about expressing things in a very philosophical and sort of ruminated way. And so when he kind of gives this brief synopsis of this adventure, I kept thinking, oh man, is this whole book going to be like this. But essentially, once you get past that sort of initial synopsis for the book and he then dives into his sort of childhood, that's when the stories become much more chronological. They become much more structured and orderly. And for me, that's at the point of the book when it really became like I'm truly fully invested in. Because not to say that I don't appreciate, a good experiential or experimental sort of insight when it comes to a book. But if an entire book is like that and you lose me, I might not necessarily be as invested. But once we get past that initial synopsis, like I said, and you get into the storytelling, he does a fantastic job, a super incredible storyteller. And he really keeps the perspective of the people that he's telling the story from, much like Tara Westover's memoir. McConaughey does a great job in giving the perspective from his father, his brothers, his mother, himself, his wife, and other people that he sort of interacted with on these adventures that he calls his life. And so, as I said, we get into stories of his childhood. He tells stories of his father and his brothers, the lessons learned from an old school hard-nosed approach that his sort of father had taken with him. I think one of the reasons why I've learned a lot to appreciate personal stories and memoirs are these stories that worked for an individual. And he doesn't necessarily say, I'm going to apply what I've learned and said, this is what you need to do. But he just simply says, this is how I was raised. This is what my parents taught me based on what they were, what they've known, how they were raised, and how they apply it to their lives. And never once does he sort of go out of the box and say that this is the one fix tell-all that's going to give you the advice you need on how to be a better stand-up citizen or a go-getter or a parent. But this is what worked for me, and this is the sort of experiences from the culture that I grew up in and the times that I grew up in as well. I think one of the stories that stood out for me the most, without necessarily him having to put it right on the nose, was the anecdote he told of his father and brother when they first got into a physical altercation, when his brother joined the same workforce that his father was in and selling, I believe it was either oil or piping, and his brother ends up becoming a better salesman than his father, and the father ends up duking it out with the brother as a sort of rite of passage, and the brother ends up knocking out his dad. But as he says, after that point in his life, after that test, quote unquote, his father never challenged his brother again. And it's one of those stories where you see this sort of hard-nosed lesson that is implemented, and again, doesn't say that all families need to do this, but for his particular family dynamic and family culture, this is what worked for them. He then goes on to talk about his own upbringing, his connection with his mother, how his mother sort of told him and his brothers to walk in a place like they owned it, not like they wanted to buy something from there. And this sort of mentality and this mindset sort of has carried with him in terms of how he's always been a hustler his whole life, and how this sort of aptitude for arguing, I should say, or debating and hustling, as he says, and grifting is deep within his soul. And this is why I think that even if he didn't become an actor, he would ultimately be good at whatever he set his mind to, primarily because he always needed to figure out what he needed to do to achieve success in a particular field. He then goes to talk about how the beginning of his acting career, how he got on to Dazed and Confused, and what that sort of led to him in terms of acting. He needed to figure out who his man was, as he would say, when he started off trying to figure out, okay, my character is this is what he is. He tried to really create a backstory for his character, and then he applied that later on in life. He then goes and talks about some of his travels, primarily to Europe, and how this was a sort of way for him to realize, as he was told when going to Hollywood, that he doesn't have to go there wanting anything or needing anything, that he needs to approach these things as if he doesn't need them. And so then the acting and the jobs and opportunities will come to him. He also then talks about different dreams that he had and how these dreams were sort of foreshadowing to different parts of his life when he knew he needed to find something to fulfill that particular part of his dream. One particular story that I found really interesting and just really entertaining is after having one of those dreams and he goes to Africa, I believe it was, and he gets into this big wrestling match with the top fighter or the top wrestler in the particular camp. And the fact that he didn't necessarily decide whether he won or lost, but after he was told that he just accepted the challenge, that everyone in the village sort of changed their opinion of him. And that was one of those lessons that he goes on to talk about, where it's not necessarily about always winning or losing, but it's about just stepping up to the plate and accepting the challenge that opportunity brings your way. Because a lot of times we will be given these opportunities, but because we figure out a way to talk ourselves out of it, or we just decide that it's not our time, they don't come back to us. And then we'll have to figure out another green light somewhere else down the road that gives us that opportunity once again. McConaughey also brings up a few bumper sticker quotes, as he likes to place them, and some that sort of stuck out to me, which I really thought were interesting, that it just gives you a new perspective or way to think about them. Is it is better to jump than it is to fall. So the idea that doing things on your own accord or at your own risk or your own choosing is much better than being forced into them. Learn to sail before you learn to fly. Great piece of thought. I had to actually sit back when I thought about that one, considering I guess it's better to understand how to manage a boat in case you crash into the ocean. Just because it says anonymous doesn't mean it has no author. Sometimes which choice you make is not as important as making a choice and committing to it. And so taking some of these words of wisdom and even applying them in your own classes could be beneficial, especially that last one about making a choice. I've had several discussions with students currently where they've talked about to me if they're kind of in the middle of either staying in a class or dropping a class and then not knowing what they need to do because they've thought so far ahead into their future. Sometimes you just have to tell them to be in the moment and be like, listen, if you drop this class now, it's not the end of the world. You may have to work a little harder down the road, but just kind of staying in this point of limbo doesn't do anybody good. So as they say, get off the pot or flush the toilet. I think I probably messed that quote up, but you know what I mean. Additionally, when it comes to this, he gets to the point where he starts talking about how he met his wife and how they had children. He also then talks about the sort of fulfillment that he needed to have. He had kind of done everything that he wanted to do with acting, and then therefore he then wanted to start a family. And with that, he understood that he had other projects going on, whether that was being a production company or a music producer as well, that he had all his hands in all these different areas and all these different sort of projects. And he knew that if he wanted to be the best version of himself as a father and as a husband, that he would have to sort of forego some of these other things. So he then took his 5 areas and cut them down to 3. So he ended up closing the production company and closing the music production company and film production company, so he could then give more time and energy to his wife and his kids. And this idea of fulfillment is something that he always sort of talks about in this book, a sort of underlying theme about you have to sort of do these things that will make you feel whole in terms of who you are as a person. First, getting to know who you are, accepting that, and then really going for the things that are going to make you truly happy based on the person that you legitimately are. So this was in kind of correlation with talking about how he was mainly doing these rom-com roles and how he wanted to be an actor and not just sort of pigeonholed or typecasted as this particular type of actor. He wanted to be characters with depth. He wanted to be characters that would be reflections of himself and who he wanted to be. And so that's when he sort of decided to step away from acting for nearly 2 years before the roles that he really wanted started to come in. And sometimes those are things, the sacrifices that you have to make in order to get to the places you want to be. And one of the quotes he talks about is self-fish. So learn how to fish for yourself. And it's a quote that kind of goes like this: when I'm rich enough to not care about the money, when a child's life is more important than my own, when my self-worth is not reliant on the adulation of others, when I don't care anymore to outscore my desires, I look near and within and get self-ish. This is the measure of a man's greatness, when a man becomes classic. When mortal rewards are no longer enough to pay his rent, man becomes legend. Fish for yourself. Self-fish. And this is where, the book sort of turns in terms of what exactly it's about. Him sort of revisiting a lot of these old stories, revisiting a lot of the old notes that he took, realizing that he actually remembered more than he forgot, and kind of bringing it to the reader's attention. And not only were these stories illuminating, entertaining, enlightening, fascinating, but dropping those bits of wisdom along the way were just nice little tidbits to pick up on as you're driving and just say, yeah, that's a great way to look at something. Or even though this man's a multimillionaire movie star, doesn't mean that he can't relate on different levels. And one part of the story that actually got me tearing up is that despite all his success, when his wife first told him that he was pregnant, he broke down in tears. He started crying, and just that part of the book itself actually got me teary-eyed, because I do remember when my wife told me the first time we were having a baby, and it's one of those moments as a father and as a parent that you don't forget. You don't forget that feeling of anticipation and surprise and adulation and just desire to know that your family is growing and what that means to you as an individual, as you kind of feel your own spirit grow in that particular point in time. So if we were to use this in class, a few things that we could talk about, as we did with the Westover memoir, is to sort of look at, primary and secondary sources. How does McConaughey's sort of memoir sort of coincide or align with some of our own experiences? How much of it is relatable? In what way, if we were telling our own personal narrative, could we use some of those examples in storytelling? And does that work on different fronts? Again, as I said, since I teach English, one of the things we do is a personal narrative. So I would definitely use some elements of his book in terms of, scene design, setting development, character development, and kind of show how he develops these characters, but keeps the tone and perspective consistent. And that's something you kind of want from your students when developing their personal narratives. In terms of the overall score of the review, this was definitely a very, very interesting read. Like I said, it's a bit more lighthearted than your Atlas of the Heart or even Westover's memoir for Educated, but it's one of those things where you can still learn from this individual. Despite our differences in terms of where he might be in terms of privilege and his part of life, it doesn't mean that the circumstances, the time, the culture that he lived in is not relatable in any way. So I would say overall, 4 out of 5. This was a very entertaining read, a very quick read. Again, I would highly recommend listening to the Audible version of it, because you do get McConaughey's sort of point of view. Like I said, the critique that I did have was in the beginning. I was kind of like trying to play catch up in terms of where he was going with some of his synopsis. But like I said, once you get past that initial introduction and you get into the storytelling, it is definitely very enveloping and intriguing. And he does pull you in, as any great actor does and any great storyteller does. Matthew McConaughey, hats off to you. Thank you for a great listen. The next time we return to our reviews, we'll be touching on one of my favorite series so far, and that is Stephen Fry's newest addition to his Mythos and Heroes collection, and we will be covering Troy.
There are no pacts between lions and men. Now you know who you're fighting.
And so I look forward to the renditions of listening to historical accounts by Stephen Fry yet again. And if it's anything like Mythos or Heroes, I know I will be in for one hell of a treat. So I do look forward to that. To you, fellow hacks, I hope you've enjoyed this review. I hope it gives you some insight into Matthew McConaughey's Greenlights. And I hope that you do have the opportunity to pick it up, read it, or listen to it. Again, recommend listening to it. But until then, and until we meet again, have a good one and take care.